generation that's going to have the most impact on all these decisions that are on right now. So thank you to the student government here today. The stimulus is obviously something designed to help the economy, and I think there's some things that work fine, such as making sure teachers and police officers and firefighters remain in place, and that was a very important thing. And specifically in our local community, in Fort Lauderdale, all the way up to there, we had a lot more people involved in it. Part of the money went into infrastructure, that's building bridges and roads and things like that. I would like to see a lot more go into it. And to me, that's where you see real infrastructure development. Number one, you create jobs. And number two, think back to the Great Depression. There's still bridges and post offices and other buildings that are up to date that we're still getting the benefit of it. So for me, investing in that is the best thing. I'm not satisfied that all the money has been spent properly. The state of Florida is still holding back some of its transportation money. We've been pushing them, all of us, Democrats and Republicans, to get it out there because job creation is key. But what we can do specifically is to continue this fight for job creation and recognizing that not that long ago, a couple of years ago, we were losing 790,000 jobs per month. Huge amount, 8 million over a period of time in the last decade. That's a massive amount of jobs. Now, the last 9 months, we've been in positive territory for private sector jobs. That's the way to go. The public sector, that's obviously temporary, private sector, and private enterprise. All the strategies that go to do that, you have to obviously focus on that attention. Specifically, when I've gone around and visited with businesses, and there's one in Lake Worth I visited, Robert Patton Inflatable. It's been around for 75 years. And they told me specifically, I said, what can we do to help you? They said, we want to create more jobs. We're having problems with bank capital, so what can we do with lending? Well, most recently, in the last couple of weeks, we just passed a bill which will take a portion of the repaid money into a fund which will incentivize small loans or medium-sized loans for small businesses in this area for getting capital back in. That is essential. I can't tell you how many conversations I've had and taking some of the specific ideas back to the conversation about how to fix it. So, number one, more capital. Number two, tax cuts for small business. Forget this idea of these international businesses getting all this benefit for shipping jobs overseas. That's outrageous. It's historical. It's not new. We need to correct that, bring every one of those tax cuts back. So every job that's created on Federal Highway here in Boca Raton, that business will get a tax cut. That will create better for the bottom line. The last thing is unnecessary regulation. Eliminate unnecessary regulation.
Yes, I think one of the things you go back and look at economics and history of economics. Japan, when they found themselves in a recession, they tried 8 to 9 stimulus packages. They kept themselves in a recession for a decade. Then also you look at this. We have had the longest string of consecutive months of unemployment being at 9.5% or higher. That means that the stimulus package, which my opponent supported, was supposed to keep unemployment at 8% or low, has not done it. Another thing we have to look at, we continue to add on to our debt. Our debt now is over $13 trillion. And one of the things that you have to understand, young man, is right now, sitting on your head, you have $45,000 that continues to slip away because of the debt that's continued to add. My opponent voted earlier this year to raise that debt limit by $1.9 trillion. I think that that is something where we're talking about the private sector growing. We're not talking about the private sector investment. You look at the statistics that have continually come out, where we have public sector outpacing the private sector in compensation 2 to 1. We have 9% growth in the public sector. 2 weeks ago, I had the opportunity to go up to Washington, D.C. And when you go and look at Washington, D.C., and look at the skyline of that place, you see one thing that you're not seeing down here. And that's construction cranes. If they're growing in Washington, D.C., that means that we're not growing down here. And one of those buildings that they're building up in Washington, D.C. is a new facility for 16,000 IRS agents, which for some odd reason was part of the health care law that my opponents supported.
You lied. Liar.
Well, maybe this is West should read the healthcare law, which I did, because it has nothing to do with construction things on that right. We're talking about. I think my biggest disagreement with Mr. West is this notion of tax cuts solve every problem. And we think back to the Great Depression and when all the students in history, we realize that recessions and depressions occur when the private sector is no longer creating jobs for any number of reasons. And today we live in a world economy. And we can talk about the fact that the United States is not creating jobs. We're tied to the European Union, we're tied to Russia, we're tied to China. A lot of things out there that may or may not want, but it's a reality. So if in fact there is a recession, the question is how do we create new jobs? Well, certainly tax cuts are part of it. But this notion of tax cuts solve every problem and all of a sudden businesses, I've talked to a lot of businesses that say, well, if you give me a couple $1,000s, I'm not going to have some hiring spree. I'm only going to hire when customers come through, and people are willing to buy what I sell. That's the bottom line. That's what I hear over and over again, and that's what we have to do. You have to create the demand. You have to create the confidence in the economy. Part of that is having a stable tax system. As I said before, it's not 1 year, 2 years, it's permanent. It's understood that it's going to be out there for a long time. Again, businesses, get rid of unnecessary regulation. I work with the marine industry in South Florida. Last year they had this problem, this unnecessary tax in the form of an insurance premium. They were paying the duplicated workers' comp. So it doesn't do anything. So I went and fought with others, but we got it done. With Democrats and Republicans, we eliminated it. And what does that mean? These businesses now have somewhere between $10,000 and $100,000 of money that they didn't have to pay. It's in their pocket. They can hire somebody. They can buy a piece of equipment. They can expand their business. This is the way you go about it.
All right, thank you. That completes the first round. On to the second round, which consists of 2 questions from the public. The first question is from Mr. Neil Case in Boca Raton. Mr. Case asks, what can we do to defend Israel against threats in the Middle East? Should the United States attack Iran to protect Israel? First answer from Mr. Plum.
Thank you. And I'm glad that you asked that question. Israel is the United States' closest and most strategic ally in the world. It's a democracy in a sea of dictatorships. It is the homeland for the Jewish people. I happen to be an American Jew, and I obviously have my own personal beliefs that I've had since I was born and will continue on way beyond my public service. I had a chance to go to Israel recently and visited with Prime Minister Netanyahu and others, and he appreciates the fact that we are working very hard on these Iran sanctions. Now, he and I and our president also agreed that the reality is Iran may not respond to this. But the goal here that all of us have, including Prime Minister Netanyahu in this conversation with our bipartisan Democrat and Republican group, was that we need to engage as many countries as possible against Iran. This should not be Israel's fight alone. This should not be the United States' fight alone. Iran having a nuclear weapon is a threat against the entire world, specifically against Israel, and definitely against the United States as well. I also had the chance in a trip to Israel to go into the northern part of Israel when Hezbollah was firing rockets down on the civilians there. You obviously are in that environment and you're racing for the shelters, and you see how these people live day to day. So my commitment, without question, and when I disagree with President Obama like I did on the settlements, I say it publicly and I'll call him on it. And when I agree, as I do on the Iran sanctions, I will support, and I worked on those Iran sanctions to make sure they were as tight as possible with Ilan Ras-Laton, who's the head of our foreign affairs committee on the Republican side. There's a bipartisan group of Democrats and Republicans. You fight hard, no tolerance for nuclear weapons, no tolerance for Iran supporting Hezbollah or Hamas or any of these other terrorist groups. This is a matter of life and death for Israel and also for our national security.
I had the opportunity to go to Israel last year. I was invited over there for a counterterrorism tour. I spent 9 days going behind the scenes. I also had 43 months of combat zone experience in the Middle East. And I can tell you that there's one thing that they understand in that part of the world, and that is strength and might. Compromise, negotiation, and appeasement is seen as weakness. And that is why we continue to have someone like Mahmoud Ahmadinejad who will come to the United States and focus in the church. We must stand and support Israel to make sure that that sovereign state can remain a sovereign state. And I think that right now we are not showing the type of resolve and the type of strength that will deter those enemies, deter someone like Iran from continuing to develop that nuclear device. But it's not just deterring Iran, but deterring those who would also seek to support Iran, be it North Korea, be it Russia, maybe even China. We know that when Israel had the opportunity to go and strike a nuclear facility in Syria, they had ties to North Korea. The critical thing is that we are not doing enough to preclude Iran from supporting state-sponsored terrorism all across the world. Be it Hezbollah, who just I think 2 months ago, we had members of the Lebanese army that fired upon members of the IDF and killed them. Also, the money that is going into the Gaza Strip. We have got to start tightening up on that regime, a regime that is led by theocrats. And those theocrats have one thing they understand. It's the return of this person called the Henry Imam, the Mahdi, 12th Imam. And that has to come by an apocalyptic event. If we think that the such thing as we have with the mutual assured destruction principle of the Soviet Union is going to work with Iran, we are not being sensible. I do not want to see another sort of Neville Chamberlain moment happen on my watch.
1 minute.
Thank you. One thing we can be proud of the United States is we have the most powerful military in the world, second to none. We don't play second to anybody. We are number one and will